When you think of the Rainforest Cafe, you probably imagine overpriced food, animatronic animals, and fake thunderstorms. It's a place for tourists, a fun spot for families. But there was one Rainforest Cafe that offered something different, something that no one really talks about. It wasn't inside the restaurant itself, but in a strange building right next to it. This was a dark ride, and few know of its existence. The only Rainforest Cafe that has one is located in Galveston, Texas. It's been said that this location has been used to test new concepts and experiment with more immersive experiences for the chain. This dark ride was one of those experiments. The staff sometimes suggests it to particularly adventurous guests, but only in a hushed tone, as if sharing a dark secret. The ride can accommodate only a few people at a time, and there's never a line, which makes it that much more eerie. I heard about it through a friend, someone who had stumbled upon it while traveling through town. He had always been a thrill seeker, someone who chased the bizarre and unexplained. When he found out about the ride, he knew he had to try it. He told me it was the strangest experience of his life, but he didn't really explain why. In fact, after he told me this over the phone, he immediately said he had to go, although I was already thoroughly intrigued. So I decided to check it out for myself. When I arrived at that Rainforest Cafe, it looked like any other location. Plastic jungle vines, fake animals, and the sounds of birds chirping over the speakers. I asked the hostess about the ride, and she hesitated before pointing me to the building next door. "Are you sure you want to do it? It's not that good," she asked, her eyes slightly concerned. I nodded, and she sighed, leading me out of the door of the restaurant and across the narrow walkway to the adjacent structure. When she walked away, I pushed open the creaky old door and stepped inside, instantly hit by the smell of damp earth and nostalgia. I've always had a love for these old-fashioned type attractions. It was a traditional indoor water ride, one with those circular rafts where you float down a river of animatronics through various scenes. A kind of zoned-out old employee pointed at one of the rafts and told me to watch my step. The ride began innocently enough. The small raft I boarded bobbed through the darkened waters, surrounded by dense jungle scenery. The animatronics were cheesy. Honestly, that was my favorite part. I remember I laughed at a strange-looking leopard that just jittered and roared at me. However, as the ride continued, the atmosphere grew a little more unsettling. At one point, one of the animatronics turned towards me and just kind of blankly stared. The raft even stopped and made for this really uncomfortable moment. Then the jungle sounds morphed into a low, almost inaudible hum that reverberated in my chest. The raft eventually started moving again, but after that, I had a much different perspective on it. I kind of just wanted to get off. However, the ride seemed to stretch on way longer than it should have, the jungle growing somehow more realistic with each passing minute. Suddenly, the boat stopped. I was plunged into total darkness. The only sound, the soft lapping of water against the sides of the raft. My heart pounded in my ears, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. Then from the shadows, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a shape, a silhouette against the pitch-black surroundings. But as it moved closer, I could make out details. It was an animal, but not like any I'd ever seen. Its body was twisted and had sickly pale-color skin, with eyes that glowed unnaturally in the darkness, and looked almost like a humanoid that was bent backwards and crawling upside down. That's the moment I started to panic. I began screaming for someone to let me off, and when no one answered, I decided to try and climb out. Bad idea. The raft suddenly started moving again and nearly crushed my leg in the process. I barely pulled it out of the water in time. It then suddenly sped up to an insane speed and began crashing into the walls on every turn, tossing me all over the raft. Finally, the raft emerged from the darkness into a small, dimly lit room. The ride was over, or so I thought, but as I stepped out of the boat, my legs shaky and weak, I realized something was terribly wrong. The exit led me into a room that looked almost identical to the one I had just left. Just more rainforest to walk through. Except now, I didn't have the protection of being on the raft. I stumbled down the seemingly endless halls, animatronic animals seeming to notice me, and began approaching. As panic set in again, I started running. I had no idea where I was going, but just kept moving forward nonetheless. All I knew was that the exit, if there was one, seemed impossibly far away. Then suddenly I turned, and the pale humanoid creature jumped down onto me, whacking me in the head and knocking me out. I awoke, locked to a metal table in a strange room, to the sound of machinery in the air, an ominous whirring that set my teeth on edge. The room was different from the others. It was vast, with walls lined with strange pulsating tubes that ran from the floor to the ceiling. The animatronics were gone, but my sense of dread had only intensified. In the center of the room stood a figure, tall and slender, dressed in what appeared to be an old tattered Rainforest Cafe uniform. Its back was turned to me, but even from a distance, I could feel its gaze. Slowly it turned around, and I nearly collapsed from shock. The face was human, or at least it had been, but something was horribly wrong. The skin was stretched too tightly over its skull, its eyes too large and devoid of any emotion. The corners of its mouth were pulled up in a grotesque imitation of a smile, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. It spoke telepathically, its voice in my head, a low guttural rasp that sent chills down my spine.
Welcome to the end of your journey.
The figure raised a hand, and the walls around me began to shift and change. The tubes pulsed faster, filling the room with an eerie greenish light. And then I saw them. Images flashing across the walls, too fast for me to process. They were memories, but not just any memories. My own memories. I saw myself as a child, at school with friends and with family. Each image was a fragment of my life, stolen from my mind and projected before me like a twisted slideshow. The figure's voice cut through the chaos.
We have been watching you. All of you.
The truth was suddenly downloaded into my brain, just as the being's words had been. I suddenly knew that this ride wasn't just a ride. It was a front, a carefully crafted facade designed to lure in unsuspecting victims. All just a plan that had been set in motion by the others for decades. They didn't always take people, just sometimes when they were riding alone and didn't have anyone that would notice them missing.
The fear you feel, the terror that hurts your heart, it tastes so good.
The figure hissed into my brain. Before I could react, the walls around me began to close in, the tubes pulsating with a sickening intensity, the green light growing brighter until it was blinding. I felt a pressure in my chest as if something was being ripped out of me. My breath was caught in my throat, and I realized, with horror, I could feel part of my soul, my very essence, being drawn out, siphoned away into the darkness. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's grotesque smile, widening in satisfaction. I woke up outside the Rainforest Cafe, the sky above me a dull gray. I was alone, lying on the cold concrete, with no sign of the ride or the restaurant. My body felt heavy, drained as if I had lost something vital. I stumbled to my feet and looked around, but there was nothing, just an empty parking lot and an eerie silence. Eventually I was able to find my way back home, and since then, have tried to tell myself it was just a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or some strange food poisoning or something. I don't know. But deep down, I think I know the truth. Something had happened in that dark ride. Something I can't explain or rationalize. I haven't spoke about it since then, and I never want to go back to Galveston again. However, sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I wonder what it was they took from me. If it was my soul, then what am I now? Did they just take part of it? Or maybe they decided in the end to leave me be, so that I could send others to the ride somehow. I guess I'll probably never know.